I will present now our next speaker, Dantes. Nancy's presenting a paper titled Bettina Lopez, Countermodernist in Arms. And Nancy's bio. Nancy is currently based in Lisbon and is a Contemporary and Modern Art Perspectives Fellow at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. She recently submitted her PhD thesis at the Rhodes University here in South Africa, titled An Archive of Upset, the shift from commissioning to curating through South Africa's representations at the Biennale de Sao Paulo and the interstitial nexus of Leonard Tsehla Mahobi Matsoso. Her research aims to contribute to a Southern perspective of exhibition and art histories. She has contributed to academic programs in art history and curating at the Wits School of Art here in Johannesburg and the Center for Curating the Archive here at the University of Cape Town. Thank you, Nancy.
So thank you again, Nkule, for that introduction. And I would like to begin with a word of appreciation, acknowledgement, and thanks to the organizers of this excellent and much needed conference, especially Ngonefal, Rose, and Anais. I would also like to express my gratitude to the Contemporary and Modern Art Perspectives program at MoMA, as well as the Gulbenkian Foundation, who sponsored a short 2-week residence in their archives in October of 2020. I unfortunately have very little time to speak to you and pay homage to the beautiful, complex and multidimensional insurgent that was Bertina Lopes, born in Lourenço Marques, today Maputo, on July 11th, 1924, and transitioned in Rome on February 10th, 2012. It is impossible to convey the full spectrum of almost 6 decades of production and her very rich and generous life with you, which was divided between Maputo, Lisbon, and Rome. Given this, I can only hope that my presentation will incite each and every one of you to take interest in her formidable practice and to further develop scholarship around her, revising the largely skewed narrative written primarily from Europe and her marginal and token position within collections, particularly Portuguese museums and institutions. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right into my presentation. This paper mirrors, doubles, and extends Professor Sylvester Ogbechi's widely read 2007 text, Portrait of the African as a Modernist Artist, which inscribed Nigerian painter Ben Nwangu as a modern artist by reading his studio as a signifier. Further to Ogbechi, in this presentation, I attempt to contribute to the gender balance, looking at the overlooked Mozambican artist, Bertina Lopes, and her specific presence in that quintessential modernist site of artistic production, the artist's chamber or studio. If Ogbechi intended to invert the canonical Western white narrative of modern art by inscribing Nwangu as a counter-modern, I wish to take Ogbechi's work a step further and investigate the implications of looking at Bertina Lopes, a biracial woman, as a modernist, who developed and perfected her art by affirming her African identity and Blackness at the height of colorism in Mozambique. A modern, Lopes dissolved received boundaries and distinctions at every level, always working in some form or other in the middle space between the tangible and the intangible. Like Ogbechi, I will adopt the image of the artist's studio, that magical space where art is pondered and brought into being, to quote Bernard Doherty, as a mediator to bring this about. Before continuing, though, I would like to make clear that my research has been severely hampered by COVID and the sequence of travel bans that we've all endured. In many instances, I find myself speculatively effabulating around, to employ Hadiet Hartman's term, the artist's portraits and oeuvre, and employing processes of inference. In terms of terminology, particularly the idea of the counter-modern, if the modern period in Africa is equated with colonialism and the introduction and implementation of repressive systems, I see Lopes as a counter-modernist, as a woman working not alone, but as part of an underground movement in opposition to the debilitating effects of Euromodernism. Unlike her peers in Europe, I posit that Lopes was deeply involved in questions of liberation and decolonization. At the risk of oversimplifying or drawing definitive lines and dichotomies, which are always oversimplifications, I posit that a radical difference between European and African modernism can be argued. On the one hand, an apolitical, disinterested North Atlantic European formalist modernism of the 1950s and 60s. On the other, the committed modernisms of Africa, which sought to make manifest the humanity of dehumanized societies. As I see it, Lopes initially oscillated between the two cultures, ultimately synthesizing both in her painterly and overlooked sculptural practice. One cannot speak of evolution or phases, as Lopes's production, as I see it, was looped and cyclical, unlike her European male peers, who produced teleological work. This portrait of Lopes was taken in her temporary studio in Mozambique in 1986. She would have been 62. Mozambique, her motherland, would be celebrating 11 years of independence. Looking at the portraits and driven by the tradition of noticing, which the specific site elicits, we see the unseen. The low shelf on the left, how and where the artist's tools rest, and how the artist, who sits in the center, sprawls in a postpartum-like pose, surrounded mostly by turned canvases and easels that bespeak of multiplicity, restlessness, issues of privacy and production. Her pose, this grandmotherly sprawl, is suggestive of her role in the birthing of Mozambican modernism and Moçambicanidade, or cultural Mozambicanness, but also her plight to be treated as an equal. Women of Lopes's generation, that is, a small Black minority who lived and worked in the capital, were considering what it meant to be modern, in opinion pieces in newspapers and in social gatherings. Writers like Noemi de Souza and Violeta Duval were questioning the subservient role ascribed to them by Portuguese dictator António de Oliveira Salazar, and his active promotion of the idea that our gender best served the nation as mothers and caretakers in the domestic sphere. Beyond the nurturing mother, commonly referred to by the appellation mamana, Lopes and her peers continued to value the role of mother and wife as central. But they also championed women as comrades and workers. Duval believed that to become respectable and modern, a new social order needed to be created, one where women would no longer behave at the pleasure of men and instead serve alongside men in working towards the advancement or progress of modern society. The modern woman was intellectually engaged, pursuing a better, more educated life for herself and for all women and girls. This intellectually engaged woman existed alongside, not separate from men in public life and culture. I'd now like us to listen to Bertina Lop's Cha-Cha-Cha by Italian expatriate band, The Five of Rome, who played at the famous Pulana Hotel in then Lourenço Marques. According to a friend of the family, the song was dedicated to the artist and stands as a testimony to her position, possibly one of sexualized vedettes a la Josephine Baker in Lourenço Marques circles. Sorry. I'm just going to ask you to just bear with me for a minute whilst I retrieve the sound file for you. Okay, I'm just going to put this on. So I'm just trying to put that back into full screen mode. So this catchy tropical tune belies the violence of the colonial encounter and the relations of domination and exploitation that characterized the meeting between white settlers and Black women. The words to the song tell of a woman's refusal of sexual advances, particularly noteworthy in the chorus, "Non quero, non gosto," I don't want to and I don't like it. We know from feminist scholar Anne Stoler that who could bed and who could wed was fundamental in the construction and upkeep of the colony. As Akea Bernard has noted, the social creation of marriageable woman is based in large part on the denigration of women of color. Both constructions require the colonization of women's bodies and sexuality for white and Black women, albeit in different ways. Lopes was by no means exempt of the white man and woman's perception of her body. She was fully aware and constantly reminded how she was sexualized and how her biracial body was loaded with intense ideological meaning, and how she was, in the colonial and neo-colonial context, required to shore up masculinity and its attendant anxieties. I would now like us to return to the image of Lopes in her studio. This is not the only image we know of her in her creative space. We will be looking at 5, but there are more. This one was taken in her studio in the second half of the 1950s. This was taken in Rome in the early 1980s. It is a remarkable image where Lopes disguises her face behind a quickly painted ritual mask, and where she seems to tell us that the studio is a site of performance. There is no canvas in view. This is her home studio in Rome in 1985. The same image appears on the first pages of the catalogue she produced on the occasion of her solo exhibition in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia in 1995. This next image was taken a year later in a foundry in Rome in 1986. The studio is a subject here, and the artist, by allowing herself to be repeatedly portrayed in it, is posing as a member of a painterly pantheon. As we see, Lopes was painfully aware of the studio as a legitimizing, quasi-mythical and privileged space, and was an artist who was keen to generate her own mythology. By looking at the sequence of studio portraits, we see how her confidence shifts. In the 1950s shot, she looks over her shoulder at us, somewhat undecided. This portrait would have coincided with colonial Mozambique. She's wearing a floral print and short, straightened hair. Her brush is poised, The space is composed, but the canvas blank. There is a restraint and undecidedness which we do not witness in the other portraits that show her in action, actively bent over in the thick of her painterly process. Could it be that Lopes, who had returned from her studies in Lisbon, was grappling with two-ness, which she would later resolve, or what W.E.B. Du Bois termed double consciousness, open quotes, the sense of always looking at oneself or over one's shoulder, through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, end quote. At this time, Mozambicans, including Lopes, were questioning the system of assimilation, which Isaacman has identified as a type of cultural whitening, whereby theoretically any African or a so-called mestiço could become classified as assimilado or civilizado. In practice, candidates had to meet a number of stringent criteria. For many, it offered a strategy for survival and an opportunity for self-improvement, but it did not necessarily mean cultural suicide or a wholesale rejection of one's African roots, as the settler administrators had hoped and intended. Mozambicans like Lopes and her peers found in negritude a locus to develop Black self-subjectivity. My sense is that the stoppage, signified by the white, untouched canvas, represents a turning point, a break with assimilated feelings of inadequacy and powerlessness, which she shared with the people around her, to one of affirmation and empowerment, which manifests in her later studio portraits. Lopes read and was certainly fueled by the words of negritudinist poet Noemi Souza, who by 1951 had gone into exile. I quote from Souza's Black Blood. Ó minha África, misteriosa, natural, minha virgem violentada, minha mãe, como eu andava há tanto, desterrada de ti, aliada, distante e egocêntrica, por estas ruas da cidade, engravidadas de estrangeiros, minha mãe, perdoa. In English. Oh, my Africa, strange and wild, my virgin raped, my mother, how long I have gone exiled from you, alienated, distanced, self-absorbed through these city streets, pregnant with a foreign race. Forgive me, mother. Looking back at our chosen portraits, in the foreground, our gaze settles, if only briefly, on the sparse open cans of paint and dripped primer that oozes down the sides. It travels almost magnetically to the artist. Apparently, no attempt has been made to tidy or sweep the studio. Rather than capture the artist in deep melancholic reflection, one sees and senses that Lopes has been interrupted by the photographer, that the studio has been invaded. Lopes sits casually, but somewhat impatiently. She seems broody. Her one foot rests slightly elevated, possibly supported by the shelf in front of her. The other points in the opposite direction. She's wearing flat, comfortable-looking leather sandals and a geometric tie-dyed dashiki dress, which was made fashionable in Algiers in 1969 at the first Pan-African Congress, attended by revolutionaries who flocked to North Africa, including the Black Panthers. We are drawn to her individuality, which is accentuated by this solitary space. She holds a ball of string in her hand, string that she employed in a number of works. If the European studio was a European chamber of imagination that intentionally drew on the development of self-referential work of art and closed aesthetic systems of late modernism, for Lopes, it was a stage where she could enact emancipation, liberation, identity as self-determination, as something found and not given. I'd now like to go back to the portraits and link them briefly to the work that she was producing at the time. Lopes' earliest work dates back to the 1950s. She's working academically and reflecting the conservatism of her Lisbon training, and was timidly producing realist still life paintings and portraits. Her work was first exhibited as part of the Segundo Concurso de Artes Plásticas, or second competition of visual arts, at the Casa da Metrópole in 1950. According to journalist Medina Camacho, she presented 7 oil paintings. These were likely to have been impressionist impastos. The quality of the portraits garnered her second prize. I've chosen to share a portrait of her mother, Cândida Mauazi Vicente do Rosário, with you. This is one of the few images of her. Unlike her father, who she portrays as a red-faced, stern, and somewhat unapproachable-looking middle-aged man in a formal blue business attire, her mother seems quite the opposite. The power relations between the two, her father, the irascible head of family, her mother, the acquiescent-looking wife, is made evident by her domestic attire, but also the scale of the paintings. Her father appears on a slightly larger piece of burlap. Lopes was arguably acutely and critically aware of the imbalance in the household. According to their grandson, Cândida and Adelino met on the Catembe beach. He was 15, she was 14. They had 6 children together. Their 2 sons died, but their 4 daughters survived, one of them Bertina. The family lived on Avenida 24 Julho in the neighborhood of Alto Maé, close to the army barracks and a garage. Alto Maé was close to the Associação Africana, or African Association, where poet José Craveirinha housed the influential newspaper O Brado Africano. This was when Noemi de Souza in turn published her writing. In the 1960s and 1970s, Lopes moved to depict social reality and integrate children into her work. Such is the case of minors on the left, white mealy-meal eyes in the middle, and the people who never die and are all remembering to the right. She also turned to include indigenous, naturally occurring, abundant materials such as raffia and fiber, which hang from Raiz Antiga, this splendid work from 1964, where the totemic form, a staple in her repertoire, appears, and where 2-dimensionality and 3-dimensionality convene. I've chosen this image from the wonderful survey exhibition she held at the Gulbenkian Foundation in Lisbon to give you an idea of the unfolding totemic in her work. By the mid-1980s, Lopes was working synthetically, operating, as Nelly Punento points out, a positive fusion and a dialectical exchange between 2 cultures, enfolding negritudinous figuration into abstraction. This was a time of affirmation for her. She had moved from figurativism to the abstract, from roots in the ground to roots in the sky. Like Mozambique, choose free to be, African, Portuguese, Italian, revolutionary and cosmopolitan. Thank you.
I think we're going to ask Nancy and Sule to now turn on their cameras, and we're going to begin the Q&A part of the discussion. I don't know if we've taken up any questions in the Q&A section, but what I wanted to kind of point out, which I'm sure you all already noted, sort of like the multiple layers of the intersections at which these presentations all touched on. So from sort of the speculative narratives of looking through the archives, or Nancy's poetic reading of the photographs, to Sule's critical analysis, as strategy of analyzing the images and in relation to each other. One is looking directly at the person and the producer of the work, and the other reading the person through the work that they have produced. And I think also, which is similar with you, Julia, in that you have the opportunity here than where you are able to engage directly with the producer of the work to talk about the work that has already that they are producing. So you are kind of very much involved in a dialogical process and of meaning making together with the artist and maker. And so for me, the thing that sort of kind of goes unsaid or was maybe not enough time for in the presentations is about the methodological approaches, right? That are specific to each research moment, that respond to both the interest and location and of the researcher in relation to the person that they are attempting to write about and study, or an element of their life and so on. So I wanted to open with that and sort of like, so what has been their experience, the positives and the challenges of finding a methodology that works in a very responsive and responsible manner to tell the story.
Is a question directed to me or to three of us?
I think to three of us, because I don't think I think it's better that we can try and have a discussion, because there are points in maybe the structural elements of the researches that are somehow similar, but there's so many divergent areas, right? So we are all working on this making presence and refiguring presence, but there are so many methodological approaches to attend to this. So I'm asking this in relation to your specific researches and your specific studies in, the specificity of each question.
All right. I think on my own part, I will speak first from my side. Now, mine have going back into archive to get works of artists. And most times I like to interact with artists, to interview them and document their works, because I see that most times artists who practice in Africa sometimes get neglected, even living artists. So most times I like to adopt a kind of research method that gets to the field, interact with the artists, try to get from them the idea behind the works, and analyze the formal elements, locate them within the cultural context, the cultural history the work actually speaks to, and then try to look at what exactly are they conveying, because such critical analysis are actually missing. And in most of the works, like the two female artists I actually focused on, when you look at their works, you will discover that if you go searching on Google, you go on whichever, you try to Google and find out about them, you will find mention of them. I am not denying the fact that maybe people who researched in Africa wouldn't have documented about them in books, like Kojo Fosu did work on them. But I do not have Kojo Fosu's book at this time to really see the area that he really focused and mentioned. But even when you look at Sylvester Ogbeche, when he, in his article on curatorial practice in Africa, around 1997 or so, when he examined exhibitions, he had also highlighted the fact that some modern artists, like the two artists I looked at, that they were actually not mentioned in some studies that were carried out even in exhibitions. Now, such kind of something require archival research. And when we try to look at method, like my two other presenters, actually, the other two presenters, they had to delve into archives, even though they also try to look at other more recent works. When we try to analyze using the perspective of the artist, the intent of the artist, it's sort of like give more light. But then on the other hand, that is not to mean that from archive, we cannot locate. If you have a team, like I tried to do, you have a team, the team can be, it's like a thematic nuance trust that give a lead to what the artists actually intend portraying. And that will help one to be able to contextualize the formal element within the cultural history that the artist actually was trying to look at. So for me, I look at formal analysis, cultural history to be relevant, but where the artists are alive, interview, it's relevant in actually bringing more light to the works that artists actually portray. Let me rest my case there for now.
Thanks, Leah. That's great. Julia and Nancy? I mean, and for me, especially your two positions, right, have something in common while they differ. So not so that, but Julia and Nancy, in the sense that Julia, the German Namibian historical relationship is a specific encounter, right? So if that affects how you as researcher affects, you know, your research is going into this context, which is kind of similar with Nancy, sort of like, but not at a different level, right? Because Nancy, you've obviously lived in South Africa. I'm sure you've traveled out to Mozambique. So you have this kind of translocation identity that the person you are researching similarly kind of has. And so what does this kind of proximity in some parts to your research subject or not, you know, I think that's what I'm trying to pinpoint as a starting point, because a lot of the questions that are coming in now in the Q&A are asking, how are you finding the people to research? Like, how are you making this decision that this is your area of interest that you want to work into?
Can I respond, Kule?
Sure.
So just sort of to respond to the sort of the last question that I think you've sort of come across, which is you know, why Bertina Lopes, how I came across Bertina Lopes. So whilst I was doing my PhD and I was doing research on Leonard Matsoso, and I think I was at UCT at the time, and we sort of, it was, I think, a very collective thing where we started to interrogate ourselves. Where are the women? And sort of as a Portuguese speaker, I asked myself, whilst I was doing my PhD, sort of Mozambican and Angolan women modernists, and that's how I came across Bertina Lopes. But at the time, you know, you can't get sidetracked. You need to stay focused. So I only sort of started doing serious research into Bertina sort of once I had sort of wrapped up my PhD, because it would just have completely sidelined me. And just in terms of methodology, I completely, I think Sule spoke beautifully about methodology and sort of how we try to go about things. I would say that I'd like to sort of emphasize that my research has only begun because I'm very much, and like you were saying, I'm very much, you know, I'm stuck. I can't move around. And the way I work is I try to sort of follow the artist on her path or on his path. So, you know, if the artist exhibited in a specific institution, so for instance, that's why I went to the Gulbenkian Foundation. I still haven't had the opportunity to travel to Rome. So Bertina her house still exists in Rome as a museum. Her husband is still alive. So that's work that I still need to do. I have. So Sule was talking about the importance of interviewing artists. Obviously, Bertina's not alive, but I've spoken to sort of friends of the family, sort of, and that's also very much been hampered. So I still need to actually meet the people because I think that that kind of, it's not enough to just send an email and wait for a response. I'm sort of waiting for the moment when we can travel again and we can meet and encounter each other physically again. And sort of, I rely heavily on that kind of engagement.
Okay, I am collecting questions, guys. So Julia, I'll let you answer that question, and then I'm going to read some questions directly from the Q&A.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Maybe just briefly, I think, of course, I have the fortunate situation that both artists are alive and accessible to me, and they were so kind and generous to share a lot of insight with me. But there's also this double layer that it's kind of a multi-layered woman's story situation that I'm encountering, because it's the women's stories that the artists tell as women artists, but then there are also these women's stories in the archives that are very difficult to retrace or recuperate. And maybe just to briefly speak about your question, I can say that the moment how I approached and encountered these artworks was where I'm, as a German, I'm very interested and engaged with German-Namibian relations, and the way there's now being efforts to work through this history or engage more deeply with it. But what is absent there are, of course, often these micro-histories or the women's experiences. And the way the debate is now currently taking place in the public discourses is one where more these major trends are very loudly debated, but they are more of these macro histories, of course. And at that moment, I encountered then the exhibition where Vichitu and Jiharine showed these works that I showed, which touched me quite a lot, because I felt that's where these alternative histories or these women's experiences become much more graspable. And that's, I like the word you just threw in, the proximity, that made it really possible to engage with these topics with a more closeness and empathy, I think. So that's why my method is one that thinks about these post-colonial debates maybe with art, because this proximity then becomes possible. And yeah, of course, just like Sule, Aman James just said, interviews and conversations are, of course, crucial. And I'm so glad that the artists, did share a lot with me. Okay, I'm sorry. Now I'll let you go on to the questions.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. So first question is from Karen Milborn, and it's directed at Nancy. So your paper was wonderful in helping us to understand Bettina Lopez's self-representation, but I'm also interested in hearing more about how this intersects with location. One studio photo was in Mozambique, another in Italy. Could you speak to the role of her movements?
Okay, sorry, I apologize to the audience if that wasn't clear. Obviously Bettina was Mozambican, and she was forced to leave Mozambique in 1964. So she had already traveled to Portugal. She had already studied in Lisbon, but by 1964 she was under surveillance by the secret police, the Portuguese secret police, because of her association with José Craveirinha, with Luís Onwana, so with a number of nationalists. At the time, she was also married to a poet who was also a nationalist and who had also been arrested. So the situation for her became quite untenable. She, like I mentioned in my presentation, she frequented the Associação Africana, the African Association, where all these people would meet. And they all knew that there were undercover security police that were watching them. I've been to the National Archives, the Tour de Tombe archives, where these records are kept. And it's really interesting because there was, all of her movements were monitored. Whenever she'd come to Portugal, whenever she'd go back, why she was traveling, everything was heavily documented. So she comes to Portugal in 1964. She leaves her children behind. And then a few months later, she comes to Portugal on a bursary to study ceramics. And a few months later, she moves to Italy She divorces her husband, the poet, who was then exiled in Paris. And she lives the rest of her life. In Italy. She comes back. She does travel back to Mozambique. So she travels back to Mozambique during independence. She traveled around the world. I mentioned an exhibition in Saudi Arabia. She exhibited in Angola. She exhibited in Cape Verde. So this is just, I hope this gives you a sense of sort of how she moved. I mean, initially, sort of until the mid 1960s, her movements were strictly between Maputo and Lisbon.
Maybe it's a kind of a practical question of like, how are you tracking this? Like, is it all sitting in one archive? Is it located across different spaces? So how are you finding these images? How are you drawing the link? How are you saying this is 69? Maybe that's like a practical question.
Okay, there is an online archive that her husband generated. So there's a wealth of information on that archive. Then and sort of another archive that I came across that has been very useful to me is Galeria Saint-Yons. It's a local gallery. They did not represent Bertina, but they would liaise with Portuguese collectors and Portuguese institutions. And they were very close friends. So I met with them. They shared their correspondence, shared their images. Like I said,
there are records.
Yeah, I'm hoping to travel to Maputo. I'm hoping to go to the museum in Maputo. I'm hoping to travel to Rome. Because I of one thing I'm quite sure is that when you go to these places, you'll find things. You definitely find things. You find people. So,
which already kind of answers another question, which is here from Lauren Latour, who says, as a student, I've never heard of these fascinating artists until now. Are there any kind of programs in partnership with schools to put in light underrepresented artists? And I'll answer that and say, all the people who are part of the AWARE program are attached to institutions on different continents and different locations. So simply doing a reverse Google search, it's a whole area of study. So go dig into it. And then a question for Julia from Sonia says to Julia, would you say the artists you looked at, despite their attachment to cultural representation and archival interest, are they tackling issues relating to African modernity through their art?
It's an interesting question. I think I'd find it difficult to give a generalizing answer, because this is probably something that the artists themselves would have to say, also since I'm not an art historian, and I don't want to impose a reading onto them. But I know from the conversation I had with both, or specifically, for example, with Vici Tua and Giharina, is that she said that for her it was extremely important of the archival images she used for this collage, for example, to use a variety and diversity of images. So there were some that I remember particularly of women that wear earrings and a feather boa. I hope that's the proper English term. A feather boa, and that spoke to a certain notion of modernity and ways of being that are other than maybe what the colonialist photographers have only envisioned, for example, with these, in contrast to these ethnographic images that you have also seen. So that was something that Giharina selected quite explicitly. But I think I would say that both women maybe, I would say, rather break free from these frameworks with their work in a way that they use these older images, but they create something new out of it that speaks to Namibian beings, identities, social beings for them, and not so much of some pre-described categories that they want to attend to. But that's just my reading, and that's surely open to contemplation or to discussion. There are certainly other readings possible, and I think would be interesting to ask the artist this, and I would like to. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think there is something that is a little bit complicating, which you pointed to anyway in the beginning or towards the conclusion, when you say that you're looking at women who are looking at women who are in archives, and so how it's like a third layer to the whole analytical process. So you're looking, and how do you look at these separately, and then how do you look at them together? And also complicating the artist who is looking at the women and complicating your own position in, in this kind of inception of looking at, for lack of a better term. So Sula, we have a question for you. It says, thank you so much for shedding light on this underrated artist. Your presentation brought insight into how they engage with cultural representation as part of the modernist agenda. But could you also speak to the role of gender, both in their approach to subject matter and perhaps why they have been less recognized than their contemporaries? And the question is from Karen Morgan. And go for it. All
right, thank you for the question. To begin with, I would like to talk about why I think they are less recognized. The first thing is very likely because maybe at that time, not much was known of them by scholars who actually were documenting works of modern artists in Nigeria. I'm saying this because, or maybe that's one possibility, that not much was known of them, or secondly, more focus was on the works of the Zaria artists and Benwongu, Aina Onabolu. And so much focus was more on these artists who were Zaria rebel. And what exactly were they rebelling about? Their resistance to colonial hegemony and all that was more of like a focus of interest for many scholars. And so people sort of like scholars seems to have focused more on the Zaria rebel, because even when it comes to the spread of art education in higher institutions in Nigeria, they were the ones that actually pioneered art departments in most institutions that came up in Nigeria, the Zaria rebels. So more focus was on the activities of these artists, in my thinking. And to the neglect of these two female artists who were practicing. And in fact, for the fact that Clara was a lecturer at that time, and she was teaching this set of students, even though at the moment I do not have detailed information as to when she started lecturing the students at Zaria Art School at that time, I believe from record, she was part of the school when it was still the Nigerian College of Art, Science, and Technology. She must have wielded so much influence of them, even though there is no credit or any mention of her to have been instrumental in any way, or she have incited. So very likely she never incited, because there's no mention of maybe the students having been incited by any of their lecturer. So it was a case of the lecturers themselves, or the students, Uche Okeke taking the lead and then bringing others together. And then they pioneered the Zaria Art Society, and then the natural sentences. But as to why this Clara as well as Afi were neglected, in my thinking, is because number one, very likely they were not so much known at that time then. And secondly, because there was more focus on the activities of the Zaria Art School artists. That, I think, in my thinking, it's the major reason why much attention was not on these women. Okay, and then coming to the issue of
you're still on that. I mean, we have only about 15 minutes left, so maybe if we just like keep the responses quite short. So if you can just finish that part, but very...
It's okay. All right. On the issue of maybe speaking to the role of gender, both in their approach to subject matter, when you look at their work, you will not, okay, even though they were female artists, they did not eventually try to show any kind of gender sensitivity in my thinking, because the three works I selected, if you look at them, their themes and their subject matter were not actually, they were broad subject matter. So they did not sort of like say, okay, because I'm female, I will actually paint themes that reflect more of female or women in the society and all that. So though they were female, but then I don't think gender really played much role, because they looked for subjects that I think interested them, that were of interest to them, and they painted those subjects.
I don't know if I would stand to agree, Sule, because one of the images that you showed foregrounds the women, and you point this out in your analysis. And you clearly say that the men are moved via perspective to the background of the image. So I think it's a matter of interpretation and reading, and through which social lens are we looking at the image in. So we can't just simply, I guess, assume, unless they are there to say that, okay, their positionality was not a feminist positionality, or this kind of very specific gendered thinking in their practice. But I also think that because we are interpreting images and interpreting, in this case, there are potentialities for different kinds of readings. And to segue into a question by Gabriela Arantes. Gabriela says they're from Brazil, and they would like to know what the social class situation of the artist was like. And yeah, I think it's we kind of assume that because they're somehow Black or African, that there is a kind of an assumption of what kind of social condition underlies or belies this kind of negation or invisibility or regime that we're speaking about. So anybody want to take that quickly? Just like, so this was the kind of situation. They were middle class, they were not so middle class. This was the economic situation of the artist, if it is known.
Okay, I think in my own view, the fact that Clara had a scholarship to study in UK, as well as Afi Ekong also had scholarship to have studied in UK at that time. So as at in the 1950s, for them to have had the privilege to study in the UK, whether on scholarship or what, shows that they were certainly of middle class. Of course, they were educated, so that should be their social class at that time.
That would be the same for Bertina Lopes. Even though, I mean, she did, so when she came to Lisbon in 1964, she came on a bursary from the Gulbenkian Foundation. Sort of when she studied, her studies would have, I imagine, would have been funded by her family. And her father was an entrepreneur, and they did live in sort of Alto Maier. So that was in sort of central Lourenço Marques. It's also, I think it's also important to sort of to recall that Bertina was considered, and she was assimilated. That was, you know, that's how she was considered. So that already implied a certain social ascension. So she had access to education, to tertiary education in Portugal that would have otherwise been denied to her. So I don't know, Julia, do you want to say something?
Yeah, so to my knowledge, the backgrounds were that Vichitra, she studied in the US art and returned to Windhoek, and both live and work in Windhoek right now. Tuli is a self-taught artist and still part-time employed, even though, she shared with me that it's getting more and more, successful with her work, so that might be changing. I don't know that, but Vichy often was funded by projects, and also right now is trying to continue another project like the one with the transnational Offiziere Songo team. But of course, due to Corona, this is impossible right now. So these things are still unfolding. So I find it difficult to give a outside perspective on that.
Okay, cool. So the questions and comments are coming in hot. So I'll just try and move some quickly. So to Sule, are there any kind of art books about Clara and Effie that you'd recommend? And there was also another request for your notes and abstract, so we can answer that separately. But I'm just putting it to you that the need to find the writing somewhere exists. Laureline Lato asked, what did these artists teach you? I think this question can be interrogated or answered together with another question, which I'm going to find, which is a broad one before going back to specific questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there's an article that I came across. It's more of a documentation that's give a kind of history. It's titled like on Chief Lady Afi Ekong in the Art Historical Account of Modern Nigerian Art. That's one article I came on, although there's no critical analysis in the work. But that article sort of give a kind of background. It's more of her history and contribution, but then no critical analysis. Artworks were shown in the article, but there's no critical analysis of that. That's an article I can make reference to. And then I know Kojo-Fosu did write about them, but right now I do not have access to Kojo-Fosu's book on these women.
I think we can share those resources afterwards. Don't worry about it, Sule. And
Okay.
There was a question from the Musa Makua as well. She asked if it was in 1959. So I've just lost the question here. But we'll answer that privately because it's more of a clarification on facts. And there was a question for Julia from Martha Kazungu, and she wants to know if the decision to show the refashioned images at Negasi, was it a proposal from the artist or the curator? And was it unacceptable for the photos to be shown at MARC?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So they were shown in Embassy, and the curator's name at Embassy was Bisrat Negasi.
Okay.
Just to avoid confusion, thanks. But it's a great answer, because I spoke a lot with Vichitra and Jiharina. Also, another artist, Nicola Pan, shared a lot of insight about the processes that this team tried to grapple with during their work, because they really found it an ethical problem to show these images within the MARC Museum. And they tried to find creative ways to deal with this. And this was then their decision, of course, in collaboration with the curatorial team from the MARC, but as well from Embassy, that they then in the phase of this research process established the contacts. And so then one of the artists, I think, got this contact to Embassy, and in joint conversation, they found this solution, as I said, as an ethical response to saying it's problematic to show this within the MARC, the Ethnographic Museum, because this is exactly the space that they're trying to confront or critique or contemplate with. And then they moved it out, but as a shared response to this, like a joint decision that they found, I think.
Great, thank you. Just to, I'll go through these comments quickly. Nadine Ziegard makes two comments, and she says she's not sure if this has been mentioned already, but Afi Ikong was also an arts promoter and gallery owner and had a lot of agency through that. And Nadine suggests that it is interesting to also look at the second and third careers in the art world, besides being artists. I'm sure that in ongoing research, in different ways, you guys do that in terms of complicating anyway the narratives. And then the last question from Karen, from Nancy. I don't know if we've already answered this, but oh no, this is not for Nancy, this is for Julia. Thank you for a very insightful paper. There is a tension in the artist's work between the personal and the anonymous in the archive. Are Tuli and Vijitua working to give names to all the women in their photographs?
Yeah, thanks. I think, yeah, this tension is definitely a very important one. So Vichy shared with me that this was something really crucial that the team tried to do in this in their work in Germany, to try to particularly find the photographs that have names, because as I said in my presentation, this is something so rare in the photographic archive. So they work particularly with those, but it's very difficult, and they had a historian in their team to try and make this possible, to find the names somehow. But as I said, this finds its limits. And Vichitua also, I think, then continued with further other images. So this was not something where she stopped then doing her work. I would assume it's maybe not the prime motivation in her art, because it's such a terribly difficult task. And to my knowledge, when I spoke about these things with Tuli, I think I felt that her approach to the archive was more one that really tried to change the aesthetics and refashion and intervene with the archive. Because again, if we also as scholars, I could say the same, if we try to go for this recuperation of biographical information and so on, still the narratives we build, they are quite flawed, or they can be very wrong in the end, or I don't know, they're just going to be one interpretation, but the archive is silent about so many things. So I felt that for Tuli, since she just spoke about the work she does with the archive, it's not so much to continue going into the archive than moving out of it and creating new narratives with the material she finds there. So that's what I said, then the biographical retrieval that becomes secondary instead of creating new imaginaries.
Okay, and we have made time, but we have one last exciting question, which is gonna bridge us over to Nando's presentation. And I'm like, we have to take it. So from Lanisa Kishner, hopefully I'm not mispronouncing. Thank you for sharing the works of artists from Mozambique and Namibia. How do you think these lesser known art histories reshape understanding about contemporary African women artists, particularly in light of art histories of Nigeria and South Africa being dominant? So I think what Lanisa is pointing out to is dominances within dominances, right? So even though we're not always looking at Euro-Western hegemonies in terms of looking at art histories, there's also other visibilities that are more prominent than others, and those also have sort of geographical impact along with linguistic impact and so on. So I'm thinking in terms of Mozambican artists, then what Nancy is probably able to uncover is there's a linguistic advantage from having a Lusophone background that someone else who would attempt to do the research could come up across some barriers. Not necessarily that it's not possible, but there are some barriers to engagement, and there are dominances within dominances, etc. So how do we complicate this?
Hello, is the question for me or for?
No, the question is general. I mean, because in what the question kind of presupposes, right, is that by already looking at Mozambican and Namibian artists, you are challenging the dominance of the Nigerian dominance and South African dominance in African art histories. So, so I guess it's to comment.
I think Okay, let me just talk about that. I think that's a very good, their focus is very important because basically, while we have more studies focus on artworks of artists from Nigeria and South Africa, but with less focus on maybe artists like female artists and others from other countries. So their work actually, it's very interesting, and I think it's giving more, it's broadening more, it's creating more a kind of wider scope of writing art historical discourse on works of contemporary and modern artists. So I think it's quite okay. It's breaking, actually, it's breaking the barrier and filling gaps and trying to see, come on, let's sort of like focus on more artists than Nigeria and South Africa. I think it's a good one.
I'll just go second, if that's okay, Nancy. It's also, yeah, my comment also just trying to complicate this, I think, as a way to speak about knowledge production that is a bit more complicated than the broader historical approaches that are out there. And I felt, I don't know, it doesn't directly respond to the question, I think, but maybe more to your comment, that, for example, what both women did, women artists, was to me so interesting because they did exactly that. They did not only speak about Namibian history, but more of its broader entanglements. And I, as I said in the beginning, I approached it through my interest of German-Namibian relations, and seeing the artworks and what's actually relevant for these women made me realize that it's so impossible, or it would be so flawed to just approach it from this perspective, because they show how Namibian history is entangled to Angolan history because Tuli was in exile there, or how Vichy also used many photographs from South African women at that time because, the geographical locations weren't always so clear, or have changed anyway, but there were shared experiences amongst these women. So I think it, in that way, their artwork speaks to me to tell us that we shouldn't look at these things in isolation, but we have to see the entanglements. And this is something that I find super interesting in terms of knowledge production. So maybe links back to this other question. What do these artists teach us? They teach us that it's more complicated.
Super complicated. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Sube. Nancy? It's basically your closing remark.
Oh, no, it's not. It's not a closing remark at all. It's just what I would like to say is that this is very slow research. It's research that requires funding. It's research that requires access. So I think you need to be affiliated to a university, for one, in order to. I mean, we know that, and I think more so. You want to read an article and it costs $50. The situation is there are tremendous hurdles, especially for scholars in the global South. So just to sort of, I think, put an emphasis on that, on. You were talking about the knowledge production, Julia, and I think where you are geographically, it really does impact and influence the work. I mean, we can do the work. There are just more hurdles depending where we are. So I know that, for instance, when I'm just this speaking more sort of anecdotally and from a personal perspective. So when I handed in my my PhD at Rhodes, I no longer had access to the university. I no longer had access to their resources. And between Rhodes and sort of between starting the fellowship at MoMA. There was this kind of, I was in a kind of a limbo where I could not access information. So this is just sort of my thoughts on on the situation.
Yeah, I think with that we'll close. Nonto's presentation is in 3 minutes. And I think to pull on the different last strands of some of the words that I picked up from all three of you is that, you know, it's a lifetime of research and engagement and praxis. There's a lot of complicity, there's a lot of complexity, we're in between lots of structural engagements, but at the bottom or at the end of it, there are individuals who are the researchers and the people being researched, and somehow the intersection of these two is the knowledge production enterprise that we are embarked on in making these history stories and lives more apparent and more visible in the spaces that maybe they don't appear to be.
Kule, thank you for your mediation. Julia, it was lovely to meet you. Sule, also thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you to our audience and the interesting questions. Yeah.